In the summer of 1874, deep within the rolling hills of central Kentucky, a wedding was about to take place that promised to unite two of the region's most influential families. It had all the appearances of a joyful occasion, with guests preparing to gather in their Sunday best, the sound of fiddles ready to lift the evening into cheer, and gossip traveling fast about the bride's beauty and the groom's wealth. Yet beneath the lace veils and polished boots lay a storm of secrets so twisted that by the time night fell, the celebration would be remembered for a crime that shook the frontier with both horror and fascination. This was not just the story of a young woman and her intended husband. It was the tale of betrayal hidden behind carefully folded smiles, of whispered accusations that bubbled underneath Kentucky gentility, and of a fatal decision that turned love into murder before the wedding vows could ever be spoken. What happened inside the candlelit farmhouse that night, just hours before the vows were to be exchanged, would not only seal the fate of the groom, but would drag an entire family name into scandal. The bride committed an act so shocking that neighbors spoke of it for decades. But that was not the end. Because in one of the strangest turns of frontier life, she would not abandon the family of her dead lover. Instead, she would stand before the altar again, this time with his own brother. Before we unravel this tale of Kentucky's doomed bride and her fateful choices, please do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell right now, because stories like this, hidden mysteries that history tried to bury, are the very tales we bring back to life here. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from, because it's always incredible to see how far these stories reach. The year was 1874, and Kentucky was a land in transition, a place suspended between its older traditions of pastoral farms and horse-breeding estates, and its growing small towns powered by markets, railroads, and the steady hum of industry. The Civil War had officially ended less than a decade before, but the echoes of that conflict continued to shape every community. Some counties remained torn apart by neighborly grudges born during the war. Others sought to heal by clinging to the rituals of family gatherings, agriculture, and the institutions of church and school. Yet across all of it, appearances mattered. A family's respectability was worth more than gold, and reputation was currency. And it was reputation that would frame the story of Sarah Whitfield and Joseph Cartwright. These two names seemed destined for happiness, but instead became symbols of deception, violence, and haunting questions that no courthouse nor church service fully answered. Sarah Whitfield was only 19 years old, yet by frontier Kentucky standards, she was already considered to be standing at the cusp between youthful charm and the societal expectation of marriage. She was described as graceful, clever, and striking, with dark eyes that had a way of locking a conversation into stillness. To neighbors, she was the pride of her family, a good match for any man fortunate enough to claim her hand. Yet Sarah had grown up in a household where whispers carried almost as much weight as scripture. Her mother raised her with strict attention to appearance, teaching her that a woman could safeguard her future not by wealth or freedom, but by marriage into a suitable family. Her father, a small landowner with some livestock and a tobacco crop, had ambitions larger than his acreage could provide. He wanted his daughter tied to a family whose name meant influence. That family was the Cartwrights. The Cartwrights had lived on Kentucky's hills since before statehood. Their reputation stretched across county lines, with uncles serving as county clerks, cousins commanding respect in the horse trade, and their eldest son, Joseph, growing into a figure admired for both his prospects and composure. Joseph Cartwright was 26, tall, broad-shouldered, and already managing one of his family's farms that supplied tobacco and corn. He was known for his generosity at church gatherings, the kind of man who donated more than a fair share to mission funds, and whose baritone voice often led the singing of hymns. Everyone said he was as respectable a man as could be. It was no surprise that after only a short courtship, Joseph and Sarah were betrothed. The match was spoken of with pride. Families nodded approvingly when the courtship became official, and there was little doubt that the union would bind two respected households together in prosperity. To outsiders, this was as pure and predictable as anything could be. The families leased the community's one fiddler to practice music for the upcoming celebration. The women embroidered dresses and the men planned for barrels of cider and whiskey. But beneath this quiet script of frontier expectancy, there was another story brewing, one seen only in stolen glances and whispered confidences. Sarah had once shown her favor not to Joseph, but to his younger brother, Nathaniel. Unlike Joseph's calm reliability, Nathaniel was fiery, restless, and mischievous. He lacked his brother's polish but held a charisma in his reckless confidence. Sarah's interaction with Nathaniel had once been the subject of subtle rumor, small enough that families brushed it aside as youthful games, but not erased from memory. When Joseph began courting her, those who recalled the old rumor thought it was strange that Nathaniel seemed to withdraw suddenly from social life. He stopped attending certain dances, appeared stiff and awkward around neighbors, and kept his distance when Sarah was present. Some believed this was respect for his brother's pursuit. Others, with sharper instincts, wondered if it hinted at deeper turmoil. Still, nothing surfaced publicly. By the spring of 1874, preparations moved forward. The wedding was scheduled for the first week of June on the Cartwright estate, a wide white farmhouse sitting on a rise above fertile bottomland. Invitations had been delivered, neighbors had stored up firewood to keep food cooking for the feast, and Sarah, though said to be quieter than usual, walked through her days with her head held high, ready to become the bride everyone expected. But expectation is rarely the same as truth, and as the day approached, subtle cracks began to show. Some claimed they witnessed tense, hushed arguments when Joseph and Sarah were left alone. A hired farmhand later testified that he once overheard Sarah weeping in the orchard, whispering words about not wanting to go through with it. Others insisted Joseph seemed unusually watchful in the last weeks, never letting Sarah out of sight, as though harboring suspicion of betrayal. No one could say exactly how the tragedy began, but when the long-anticipated wedding day finally arrived, the Cartwright estate stood ready for music, feast, and vows that would never be spoken. The congregation of neighbors gathered on the lawn beneath ribbons strung from oak trees. Voices laughed over cider barrels, fiddlers tuned their instruments, and the candles in the farmhouse windows were ready to glow once the evening air settled into darkness. Sarah stood in her gown, quiet but composed. Joseph appeared at her side, smiling as expected. Yet sometime between dusk and midnight, the joy turned to shock. Details of what happened next are contradictory in community accounts, but what all reports agreed upon was this: Joseph Cartwright never made it through the night alive. Sarah, the bride not yet a wife, struck down her groom before they could reach the bridal chamber. Some say the murder weapon was a revolver left in a drawer, its sudden bark silencing laughter into screams. Others insist it was a blade, slender and deliberate, smuggled among her garments. But what followed was not only the stunned horror of a wedding turned into bloodshed. What followed was the collapse of every assumption about appearance, devotion, and trust. Neighbors were not merely shocked that Joseph Cartwright was gone. They were haunted by the impossible reality that his bride had taken his life before their vows could be sealed. The wedding feast dissolved into chaos. Some ran into the night crying, others rushed to restrain Sarah as she stood trembling, garments spotted with red. What she said in that moment became the subject of gossip. Certain witnesses remembered her muttering about Joseph's cruelty, claiming she could not live as his wife. Others insisted she seemed driven by madness, repeating Nathaniel's name under her breath. Regardless, Joseph's body lay still, and Sarah's fate now became entangled with a scandal no family reputation could protect against. In the hours that followed, as neighbors huddled outside in disbelief, questions erupted. Why had Sarah done this? What dark quarrels between bride and groom had led to such an act? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why within a year would she marry Nathaniel Cartwright, the very brother of the man she had slain? This is the heart of the story of Kentucky's Bride of 1874. And to understand how a wedding turned to bloodshed and then transmuted into something even stranger, a forbidden new marriage, we must trace the history not merely of Sarah and Joseph, but of the Cartwright family itself. Their bonds of loyalty, their hidden rivalries, and their thirst for appearances created a climate in which love, envy, and control twisted into violence. This was not the exception, but in some ways, the reflection of an America still emerging from chaos, a land where social masks concealed darker intentions. And so we move deeper into this mystery. What did Sarah know that others did not? What hold did Nathaniel have upon her decisions? And how did a family famed for respectability allow scandal to evolve into a second marriage that still haunts history? The aftermath of that bloody night did not begin with open answers, but with silence. And silence is often the loudest companion to tragedy. Those who wandered home across the Kentucky hills in the early morning hours carried with them questions that gnawed at reputation, family, and morality alike. Why would Sarah Whitfield, a bride lifted into respectability through her engagement to Joseph Cartwright, choose to strike down her future before it began? To answer that, history demands more than a glance at the evening of the crime. It requires a slow passage backward through Sarah's young years, the image Joseph projected, and the bruising weight of honor within families like theirs. Sarah's upbringing carried all the beauty of Southern gentility, but little of its mercy. Her mother, Lydia Whitfield, modeled discipline more than warmth, teaching her daughter that her true worth lay not in her mind or talents, but in the alliances she could form through marriage. Her father, John Whitfield, was a man constantly chasing affirmation, his modest farm always a mirror reflecting his disappointments. He wanted to climb socially desperately. Sarah was his ladder. By the time whispers emerged that Joseph Cartwright had taken an interest in her, the Whitfields considered their daughter's independence over. She was a political card to be played, her consent treated as tradition required it to be, quietly given, quietly silenced. Those close to Sarah remembered in later years that she had a habit of standing by windows at night, staring across fields as though waiting for someone to appear in the moonlit distance. This melancholy, so uncharacteristic of a lively young woman, hinted that her heart did not belong where her family pressed it. If one believed the testimonies whispered by neighbors, Sarah had long been attached to Joseph's younger brother, Nathaniel. Nathaniel, with his easy grin and burning energy, whose eyes followed her in church pews with an intensity Joseph never displayed. The rivalry between the two brothers was, at first glance, unspoken. Joseph, older, seemed destined to inherit the role of family patriarch in time, with all the responsibilities and respect that entailed. Nathaniel, freer from expectation, often took to wild ventures, racing horses, gambling with travelers, roaming into towns where respectability held less sway. For Sarah, Nathaniel represented the flame, Joseph the safe hearth. Yet when it came time to seal her future, the Whitfields chose the hearth, safety, reputation, and prosperity. Love, in their view, could be taught or at least endured. Joseph, however, was not only safe. Behind his well-tailored Sunday attire and steady baritone, there was an unyielding need for control. Historical accounts suggest that Joseph's nature carried streaks of jealousy, a possessiveness so deep that even minor signs of disagreement stirred suspicion. He was said to keep a close eye on his household servants, read his sister's letters when he thought no one noticed, and inquire obsessively about Nathaniel's whereabouts. To his community, this vigilance was presented as responsible concern. To those behind closed doors, it may have been domination clothed as devotion. Sarah's life in those last months before the wedding seemed divided between duty and desperation. Some claimed she confided to a school friend that she felt imprisoned, that she feared Joseph's temper if she ever resisted his wishes. Others recalled that she grew increasingly pale in church, gripping the hymnal with white knuckles, her songs subdued. Whether it was the oppressive expectations of her parents, the suspicion that Joseph could become tyrannical, or the enduring pull of Nathaniel, Sarah's heart was clearly in turmoil. And turmoil, when pressed beneath the weight of silence, often erupts with violence. The idea of a woman defying marriage in the 1870s threatened more than just personal fate. Marriage defined a woman's worth, and to reject a suitor of Joseph's standing would bring humiliation upon her family. It was not merely a love story, but a contract between households. By standing against it openly, Sarah would risk casting both Whitfields and Cartwrights into scandalous light. That was a cost neither family could endure, which meant if Sarah sought freedom, her choices narrowed to the reckless: escape in secrecy, a ruinous runaway, or destruction from within. And destruction may have seemed to her the quieter path. Joseph's final hours that fateful night remain obscured by contradiction. One witness whispered that she saw them argue near the staircase, Sarah withdrawing a small object from beneath her gown. Another insisted Joseph approached her kindly in the chamber set aside for them, unaware of the storm gathering in her resolve. In either case, the act came suddenly, cold steel or booming shot, and the respectable groom, the man chosen to lead her life onward, lay still forever. This was no accident, no nervous betrayal of promise. It was an execution, carried out by a woman once described as meek. In the valley the next morning, the news traveled faster than wagons could carry. Farmers setting out for the tobacco fields stopped work to trade rumors. Preachers mounted their pulpits, speaking of sin and warning against hasty judgment. Some rushed to pity Sarah as a fragile victim of madness. Others branded her a serpent, unfit ever to be mourned herself. And Nathaniel Cartwright emerged suddenly from silence, his grief strangely interwoven with longing. He defended Sarah when neighbors spat accusations, telling anyone who would listen that she was misunderstood, broken by pressures few could imagine. The trial that followed stretched reputation to its edges. Courtrooms in Kentucky may have been dusty, but they wielded power as sharp as any sword. Sarah was brought in, her garments sobered to black, her eyes lowered, her face pale enough to inspire pity from some, disgust from others. Her defense leaned on whispers of Joseph's cruelty, on the emotional battering she was rumored to endure. Witnesses rose to deny it, and others mumbled uncertain truths of overheard quarrels. The jury, composed entirely of men, found themselves in the uneasy position of balancing the sanctity of marriage against the obvious tension surrounding its impending vow. Weeks dragged into months, neighbors watching as if a theater unfolded in the courthouse. Every headline spoke of the bride who killed her groom. When judgment fell, it did not match the community's expectations. Rather than the gallows, Sarah received a sentence softened by considerations of youth and supposed fragility of mind. Some muttered that the Cartwright family pulled strings behind closed doors. Others that Nathaniel himself persuaded allies to temper punishment. Whatever the true cause, Sarah left that courtroom alive, her punishment more social than physical. She was to live in stigma, carrying a name whispered in every gathering, marked by death, yet untouched by rope. But what stunned the county further was not merely that Sarah survived the law, it was who she chose within a year to stand beside again at the altar. Nathaniel, the brother of the man she had slain, took her hand in marriage. Neighbors called it an unholy union, a desecration of decency. The church split with an argument. Was marriage between Sarah and Nathaniel a mockery of covenant, or a chance at redemption for two souls bound by tragedy? Their vows whispered against condemnation. But every pew shook with judgment. The scandal cemented itself in Kentucky folklore, told beside fires or muttered in gossip as families recalled 1874, not for harvests nor politics, but for the bride who had ended a life to claim a love society could never validate. For Sarah, life stretched onward in the shadows. Her name appeared occasionally in county records, tied to land deeds and children born. But her presence remained spectral in memory, a ghostly reminder that beneath respectability and ritual lies the trembling heart, capable of betrayal, capable of violence, and capable, always, of defying the script written for them by family or fate. And so, as decades passed, the question remained. Did Sarah strike Joseph out of self-defense, fear of cruelty, and suffocation beneath male control? Or was this act the cold calculation of a woman determined to reshape her life according to forbidden love for Nathaniel? History keeps no simple answers, but the tale continues to whisper across Kentucky's bluegrass hills. The trial of Sarah Whitfield Cartwright was over. The verdict had been delivered, the courthouse emptied, and the whispers slipped back into parlors and saloons. Yet in truth, the judgment did not silence the story, it inflamed it. Across Kentucky, the outcome was debated with a ferocity that rivaled politics or war. People asked not only whether Sarah was guilty, but whether justice had truly been served. And behind that question lingered the deeper one. What did this trial reveal about the community itself, and the role women and men were forced to play in the dance between honor and duty? The courtroom records describe how Sarah appeared on the final day of trial. Her black dress clung tightly, deliberate in its mourning suggestion. Some jurors remarked afterward that her lowered gaze carried enough humility to soften even a hardened heart. Others swore they saw cunning in her silence, a well-played theater designed to bend verdicts in her favor. Whatever the truth, when the sentence spared her life and offered instead a gentler punishment, the crowd outside roared with division. One half cried outrage for Joseph, the groom so brutally cut down, insisting a rope should have been her only conclusion. The other half, quieter yet insistent, claimed it was mercy, perhaps divine, perhaps human, that drew her away from gallows timber. The newspapers amplified the rift. In nearby towns, Columns published with dramatic flair referred to the episode as the widow bride case, even though she had never technically been a wife. Headlines leaned on exaggeration, describing Sarah as a seductress drenched in blood one day and as a victim of patriarchal cruelty the next. Each storyteller claimed authority, but what none could deny was that Kentucky had found itself a tale that rattled the foundations of gender and justice. For the Cartwright family, however, life after the trial was more personal, more dangerous. Joseph's absence left not just a vacant estate, but a gaping wound in reputation. Families like the Cartwrights built their existence on maintaining status. Their name was a currency in churches, courts, and markets. To have Joseph's name forever tethered to murder by his own bride was almost unendurable. Some Cartwright cousins in distant counties allegedly changed the trajectory of their introductions, downplaying connections to the family seat. Only Nathaniel embraced the scandal, and not in denial, but in defiance. Nathaniel visited Sarah in the months that followed her sentencing. Neighbors who watched him ride down the dirt lanes toward her family's house trembled with indignation. His loyalty seemed unnatural, almost mocking his brother's grave. When Sarah returned his visits quietly, slipping onto the porch for long conversations, tongues wagged more than ever. The whispers of their earlier connection, dismissed as young fancy, now ignited into suspicion. Had Joseph been killed not for his own cruelty, but as the obstacle to a forbidden love between bride and brother? Church leaders pleaded with Nathaniel to abandon what they called a dangerous pursuit of sympathy distorted into sin. His own parents are divorced. His mother, broken by Joseph's death, declared she would never forgive a union between Nathaniel and Sarah. His father, weary of public insult, attempted compromise, urging Nathaniel to focus on his work and bury his attachments. Yet Nathaniel, for all his reputation as reckless, proved unflinching. He declared loudly to friends that he did not believe Sarah's act had been madness nor lust for blood. He insisted she had been driven to desperation by forces invisible to the town. And slowly he made his intentions clear. If Sarah were branded unworthy of any man, then he would take her hand. Scandal be damned. By the winter of 1875, less than a year after Joseph's body had been laid beneath Kentucky soil, wedding whispers stirred once more. But these were not whispers of joy, nor of a community gathering. They were whispers of outrage that Nathaniel Cartwright had secured the minister's agreement, against church protests, to marry Sarah. The ceremony was said to have been attended by only a scattering of witnesses, some sympathetic, others merely curious to watch what they regarded as a grotesque performance. Gone were the fiddles, the barrels of cider, the colorful ribbons. The second wedding of Sarah Whitfield held no songs of blessing. Instead, most who attended remembered the silence, heavy as stone, and the minister's voice wavering as if reluctant to pronounce the sacred vows. When news spread across the county lines that Sarah, the woman who murdered Joseph, was now Sarah Cartwright once more, the wife of his own brother, the story moved swiftly from tragedy into legend. No preacher's sermon could outpace the gossip. To some, it became conclusive proof that Sarah's act had been calculated from the start, a cold-blooded plan to exchange brothers. To others, it was evidence of a cursed family, bound to be haunted by betrayal across generations. Her life with Nathaniel after an uneasy duality marked that infamous marriage. In public, they attempted to maintain domestic peace. She bore him children, moved into his modest estate, and managed the household as any respectable wife. Yet the community never let her forget. At the market, women turned their backs. At church, pews emptied when she entered. Newspapers occasionally resurfaced the scandal whenever gossip ran thin, calling her the bride twice named, or sometimes more cruelly, the widow of two brothers, one in spirit, one in flesh. Nathaniel endured equal venom. Friends of Joseph's memory branded him a traitor to kin. He broke ties with cousins who publicly detested him, and while he continued to farm and trade, his standing among the county elite slipped. Respectability could not coexist with a household that reminded neighbors of murder and rumor. But if the cost was isolation, Nathaniel appeared to pay it without hesitation. Accounts from a later decade describe him defending Sarah fiercely in taverns when her name was mocked, his hand gripping knives and bottles to silence insult. One such confrontation left him with a scar across his eyebrow, a reminder carved in flesh of the choice to love her against the world. The children they raised tell another part of the tale. While details grow scattered in the record, there were at least 2 sons and 1 daughter who survived into adulthood. These children bore the Cartwright name but carried in their community the shadows of their parents' scandal. Teachers whispered when they recited lessons, storekeepers hushed customers when they approached, and prospective suitors measured carefully the risks of courting into such a lineage. The sins, real or imagined, of Sarah and Nathaniel were never allowed to remain solely their own. The family bore them collectively. Through all of this, Sarah herself retreated from public rebuttal. She spoke sparingly in gatherings, avoided attempts by newspaper journalists to capture her words, and seemed to live her story not as a defense, but as a survival. Some described her in old age as gaunt, her eyes retaining the same melancholy that once gazed through midnight windows. Others, perhaps more charitably, claimed she showed a resilience few could equal, having endured humiliation, loneliness, and whispered hatred, yet managing a household and raising children in defiance of her neighbors' disdain. Folklore soon seized on her silence as mystery fuel. When stories are not answered, they multiply. Tales emerged that Sarah confessed on her deathbed that Joseph had been cruel in ways no one saw, striking her in private and promising worse if she ever defied him. Other versions claimed she admitted nothing, but instead stared into the shadows and murmured Nathaniel's name with her final breaths. Still others pictured a supernatural curse, insisting no woman could move from one Cartwright brother to another without damnation chasing her across the years. By the end of the century, her story was no longer recounted as memory by those who lived it, but told as morality tales by their grandchildren. Some families cited her tale as a warning against impulsive love. Others adapted it to scold women who strayed from their domestic duty. And in hushed conversations, young lovers at county fairs whispered it as proof that passion could topple the very expectations that imprisoned them. Sarah's actions moved from scandal into myth, her figure a mirror in which each generation saw what they needed: a villainess, a victim, or a woman who broke free regardless of consequence. Through each retelling, the central irony remained. Sarah Whitfield Cartwright, a bride who killed her groom, became a bride again to his brother. In the Appalachian tradition of ballads and ghost stories, contradictions like this do not fade. They become eternal. Each time someone walked past the Cartwright estate, eyes drifted to the windows, half expecting a shadowed bride in white, blurred against memory. Children dared each other to knock on the door, believing curses lingered still. And older men in taverns swore that on Joseph's grave no grass grew steadily, as though even the earth refused to forget betrayal. Her story was not confined to Kentucky for long. Traveling preachers carried their outline to Tennessee and Ohio. It appeared as a shortened anecdote in sensational dime novels that thrived on tragedy. By the 1890s, the names were softened into fictional disguises, but the plot remained nearly identical. A bride, a groom, a gun, a grave, and a second marriage. The fact that readers bought such stories eagerly showed that Sarah's scandal tapped into deep veins of fascination for all Americans: the fear of family betrayal, the shock of inverted morality, and the question of whether love justifies stepping outside society's walls. For Kentucky, the scandal never fully healed. Families moved on, fields were tilled, children grew, and wars came and went. But whenever conversations turned to strange tales of the past, the name Sarah Whitfield Cartwright rose like a ghost into the room. No one could say for certain whether she had killed for freedom, madness, or forbidden passion. But every listener nodded to one truth. Hers was a story that captured the unsettled heart of the frontier, where law was young, community fierce, and individuals sometimes desperate enough to carve their fate with blood. The story of Sarah Whitfield Cartwright did not end with her second wedding, nor with the raising of children under the heavy gaze of a suspicious community. It endured because it became so much more than a local scandal. It became folklore. Through repetition, alteration, and reimagining, her crime and her subsequent marriage to Nathaniel were retold until they stopped being simple facts of record and instead transformed into symbols. Symbols of betrayal, of love twisted into darkness, of defiance against rules that bound women and men alike. While the newspapers had turned her into a headline, it was the people, ordinary churchgoers, farm wives, tavern storytellers, who turned her into legend. In the Appalachian foothills of Kentucky, stories were more than entertainment. They were teachers. A single tale could instruct an entire community in morality, instill fear in the young, or preserve a family's pride or shame for generations. Against this backdrop, Sarah's murder of Joseph, followed by her astonishing marriage to Nathaniel, became a pliable narrative. Parents wielded it to warn daughters against rash romantic attachments. Ministers invoked it as proof of sin's subtle creeping power. Gossipers used it as a weapon, tarring acquaintances guilty of much smaller indiscretions with the threat of ending up like that Cartwright bride. The fascinating part, of course, is how the meaning of her story changed depending on who told it and what they meant to convey. For some communities, Sarah was a wicked woman possessed by lust, proof that unchecked desire led directly to the grave. In those retellings, Joseph became a saint-like figure, cut down by betrayal. But in other retellings, especially whispered among women when men were out of earshot, Sarah became almost a tragic heroine. A woman trapped by family's expectation, hemmed in by social contracts, fighting for freedom in the only way the time permitted. For those listeners, her act, horrible as it may have been, carried glimmers of resistance against a world that denied a woman's choice. That tension, between Sarah as villainess and Sarah as victim, is what allowed her tale to thrive for decades and beyond. Folklore loves ambiguity. A story with simple moral clarity tends to fade after a generation. A story that can support multiple interpretations, that breathes contradiction, survives. Sarah and her two husbands, one murdered and one wed against the grain of decency, provided endless contradiction. Was Joseph secretly cruel behind closed doors, his polished social reputation a veil concealing private tyranny? Or was Nathaniel the schemer, encouraging Sarah's resentment of his older brother until it reached a lethal conclusion? Or perhaps Sarah herself, with envy or desire, premeditated it all, weaving her way from one brother to another with blood as her dowry? Each possibility enchanted storytellers who found in the questions more juice than in any single true answer. Psychologists, looking back on the case with modern eyes, see it as a fascinating study in repression and familial conflict. Sarah stood at a crossroads of expectations so heavy they bent her existence. Marry for reputation, she was told. Stay quiet, she was shown. Do not speak of real longings, but smile at chosen fate. In this sense, she embodies what we call a pressure cooker figure of her time. And when pressure has no valve, it seeks to erupt. Many women collapsed inward, suffering silently. In Sarah's case, the eruption took the form of violence that shocked every surrounding farm. From Nathaniel's perspective, psychology paints him as a man accustomed to living second in line, a restless charmer who could not bear to remain in his brother's shadow. Some accounts speculate that his loyalty to Sarah after Joseph's death had as much to do with rivalry as with love. In claiming Sarah, he claimed equality or even triumph over the brother who for years had stood as a model of respect. Seen in this light, Nathaniel's marriage to Sarah was not romantic devotion, but a kind of winner's declaration, an open hand pointing at Joseph's grave and insisting, "I have taken what was yours and she chose me still." Folklore strengthened these psychological angles. In one version passed down through Knott County, old storytellers claimed Joseph had once beaten Nathaniel at a horse race before a crowd of men, humiliating him with laughter. They claimed that from that day onward, Nathaniel swore to have something greater than Joseph. The fact that he eventually stood at an altar beside Sarah was treated not as a coincidence, but as fulfillment of a dark oath. Of course, such stories may not be factually true. Folklore is rarely factual, but they demonstrate how community imagination dramatizes real lives into myths. Another strand of folklore pushed Sarah's tale into Gothic territory. These tellers described Joseph's spirit lingering long after his burial. Farmers swore his figure drifted near the Cartwright fields on stormy nights, lantern in hand, a groom searching eternally for his lost wedding. Others insisted his ghost would stand by Sarah's window, unforgiving. In these versions, her second marriage was plagued by uncanny events: cows found dead in barns, candles blown out without a breeze, children crying in unexplainable fear at midnight. Whether any family actually witnessed such things hardly mattered. The ghostly version satisfied hunger for eerie meaning. Murder does not leave quietly, it lingers. More sensationalized retellings spread further afield. Traveling balladeers took the skeleton of Sarah's scandal and set it to music. Songs of the widow bride of banished love or the Kentucky murdered groom appeared in sheet music by the 1880s, evidence that her notoriety reached even parlors where the family name Cartwright meant little. These songs exaggerated details: Joseph slaughtered on the altar steps, Nathaniel swooping as rescuer hero, but they entrenched the basic plot into the cultural record. People wanted not just to hear of her crime, but to sing it, to dramatize it over fiddle and banjo strings. For true crime enthusiasts of today, her case holds another kind of fascination. It demonstrates how communities once processed crime through moralism rather than forensic detail. Modern audiences, accustomed to DNA evidence, police reports, and psychological profiles, notice how little of Sarah's life was actually documented with precision. Instead, every angle came filtered through reputation. That absence of fact transforms Sarah's story into a puzzle, a canvas on which imagination can paint endlessly. Was she guilty of passion, panic, or premeditation? Was Nathaniel manipulative or merely besotted? Did Joseph deserve pity, or had he worn a mask that hid abuse? The fewer the records, the stronger the oral tradition. This lack of certainty also explains her endurance in American cultural history. The 19th century overflowed with murder trials, many of them bloody, many involving women. Yet most faded from public imagination within a decade. Sarah did not. And she did not because her story was layered too neatly to forget. A beautiful bride, a respected groom, a gun or knife in the shadows, a brother stepping in to wed the widow before vows were ever spoken. It was too poetic, too archetypal, too shocking in its reversal of roles. In storytelling terms, it had everything. And consider, too, the natural human attraction to stories of transgression. Tales of loyalty satisfied listeners, but tales of betrayal fascinated them. A bride who leaves a groom at the altar is scandalous enough, but a bride who slays him and then joins hands with his sibling? That explodes morality to pieces. It pressed against every expectation of womanhood, of family loyalty, of society's rules. And that defiance became irresistible fuel for the imagination. Whether you regard her with anger, pity, or curiosity, Sarah's legacy testifies to the power of one single moment to define a lifetime. She was not a governor's daughter, not a famous actress, not a noblewoman shaping kings. She was a farmer's girl in Kentucky, but when she struck, her act traveled endlessly. That simple fact points to the hunger humans feel for stories that show us, in grotesque exaggeration, the very boundaries of our lives. What happens if love turns to violence? What happens if family bonds twist into rivalries? What happens if the rituals meant to preserve respectability collapse in blood? Sarah's tale answers all with a chilling note. Then the community will never forget you. By the turn of the 20th century, her name was invoked less as a family scandal and more as a legend. But legends often achieve what facts cannot: immortality. And Sarah's immortality came not from books written about her, but from the endless retellings at tables, gatherings, and later radios, then podcasts, then YouTube channels that keep her shadow alive today. For though the Cartwright land may no longer carry her presence, the story, the bride who killed her groom before the wedding night, then married his brother, belongs now to the landscape of cultural memory, as indelible as the hills where it was born. Stories like Sarah Whitfield Cartwright's do not live in isolation. The 19th century brimmed with sensational murders, betrayals, and scandals that could have displaced hers, yet time revealed why her tale endured while others faded. To understand this, we need to examine both the cultural landscape of crime in America during the era and the framework through which communities preserved memory. In that way, we see that Sarah did not simply commit a crime. She stepped into a cultural stage already eager for roles like hers, roles soaked in shock and contradiction. Throughout the 1800s, American papers made household names out of killers. The rise of the printing press and the hunger for what newspapermen called penny dreadfuls meant that grisly details of death could sell faster than sober accounts of politics. Women who murdered men, especially men they were meant to marry or obey, made for irresistible headlines. Take, for instance, the story of Roxolana Druce, who in 1887 murdered her abusive husband in New York, sparking fierce debate over female virtue, self-defense, and morality. Her public hanging became a major subject of sensational coverage. Or consider Lizzie Borden in 1892, whose axe murders of her father and stepmother would eclipse almost every other crime of the century, turning her into the infamous rhyme, "Lizzie Borden took an axe." These women's names etched themselves into popular memory, but in Sarah's case, she achieved immortality without the mass national coverage of later decades. She endured because her scandal was more than one sudden act. It had layers that folklore could mold, and that is where comparison shows its brilliance. Roxolana Druce offered an argument about abuse and women's rights. Lizzie Borden presented the puzzle of guilt or innocence. But Sarah? She crossed a line that no society easily comprehends. She killed a groom before vows were exchanged, then married his brother. That single plotline outraged multiple moral foundations at once. She defied the sanctity of marriage, disrupted family loyalty, twisted the binding nature of womanhood in the era, and broke through her family's structured expectations, one act, but against many walls at once. Folklore depends on such multiplicity. If a story challenges one cultural category, it survives as a shocking anecdote. If it challenges several, it mutates into a perennial tale. For Sarah, her crime whispered dangers about female rebellion, challenged the pride of male reputation, and scandalized the sanctity of family. That trifold of shock sustained her in memory, while countless other brides and grooms lost to crime slipped from recollection. This multiplicity also explains why communities across America embraced her tale as if it were partly their own. Appalachian families bound tightly to kinship and gossip saw in Sarah a mirror of what could unravel their own households. Southern storytellers, steeped in codes of honor and hospitality, recognized the horror of betrayal laced with charm. Even distant northern cities reading the shortened newspaper accounts recognized in Sarah's case a grotesque shadow to their own orderly parlor expectations. Everyone saw themselves in the contradiction, and that ubiquity made her story elastic. Now consider contrast framing. Many crimes of that time involved outsiders, bandits, strangers, vagrants passing through town. When those figures murdered or stole, communities buried their memory quickly, satisfied by the cleansing power of frontier justice. But when crime came from inside, from a woman dressed in a bridal gown, from inside a respected family's parlor, then the terror doubled. Outsiders could be hanged and forgotten. Insiders forced communities to question themselves. That questioning left deeper scars, and deeper scars are remembered longest. Sarah, in that sense, represented the ultimate insider threat, a bride trusted not 30 feet from the altar. This is why, in retelling her story alongside other famous female killers of the century, one sees the peculiar strength of the Kentucky scandal. Where others lived in court records, she lived in ghost tales. Where others inspired debates on justice reform, she inspired fiddle ballads across valleys. And where others became pinned into neat categories, madwoman, abused, malicious, Sarah remained slippery, always shifting identity depending on who retold her. That slipperiness ensured not only her survival in memory, but her adaptation to every generation's anxieties. By comparing Sarah with the infamous Lizzie Borden, we also see distinctions in perception. Lizzie belonged to a later, more urban context, where journalists dissected evidence and defense attorneys wielded newspapers. Sarah belonged to a rural cultural ecosystem, where gossip spread faster than headlines and stories grew with each retelling. In Lizzie's case, people debated evidence for decades. In Sarah's case, evidence matters far less than the symbolic arc of betrayal. This is why her tale, though smaller in print, often feels larger in myth. As the 19th century slipped toward the 20th, communities sought increasingly to cement their identity through stories of caution. Railroads linked towns, factories expanded, but rural communities clung to traditions, even traditions of fear. Parents told Sarah's story not with interest in strict accuracy, but with dramatic punch. They piled on details: the gown stained red every year on its anniversary, the grave that refused to grow grass because embellishment made the lesson sharper. Whether true or not, people carried the emotional truth. That betrayal of social order always attracted judgment, and in that cultural lesson lies another truth. Memory favors stories that instruct the living. If Sarah had vanished after her act, perhaps found guilty and executed, her tale might have been sad but soon lost. The fact that she lived on, married Nathaniel, bore children, and transformed her scandal into daily life, that unsettled people more. Because it shifted the scandal from remote crime into everyday coexistence, she remained visible, evidence that communities forgive nothing, even as time marches on. Her survival meant gossip never died. For modern audiences, this survival gives her an edge over other cases too. True crime today thrives on unresolved paradox. We stream hours of series not because facts alone entertain us, but because contradictions haunt us. Sarah's contradictions, murder and love for another brother, a crime followed by marriage, fit perfectly into that psychology. We cannot stop leaning forward to glimpse which mask is her true one: sinner, victim, survivor, or schemer. Even more fascinating is how the broader setting of Kentucky shaped her story. In 1874, the state struggled between its antebellum past and its uncertain modernity. Families still leaned heavily on reputation, female virtue was policed with intensity, and masculinity meant honor beyond question. Place Sarah in a city like Boston, and her trial might have been analyzed through early feminist lenses. Place her in Kentucky, and she became a ghost story, geography-guided memory. Travelers passing through rural Kentucky years later often commented on locals' fascination with crime stories, bandits from Tennessee, bloody feuds in West Virginia, and tales of betrayal from within households. Folklore fed on those events, crafting morality plays out of them, not for entertainment alone, but as warnings. And Sarah became the ultimate warning because she embodied both allure and catastrophe. She was beautiful, intelligent, and full of promise, and yet look what she had done. Contrast this with tales of male criminals. Men who murdered for gold or jealousy often became infamous outlaws, or even romanticized anti-heroes, Jesse James, Billy the Kid. Women who killed, however, rarely became admired. Instead, they were pathologized as monsters or painted as tragic damsels driven desperate. Sarah's story drifts between both, monstrous to some, sad to others, never comfortably resting in one role. That liminal status makes her endlessly retellable. As railroads carried migrants westward, emigrant families carried Sarah's story too. Oral truth spreads like a seed. And thus, she joined the larger American tradition of wicked women lore, alongside names both recorded and invented. But in her case, because she lived with Nathaniel and left descendants, her scandal continued to shape real people's reputations long after the century ended. Her children carried whispers. Her grandchildren inherited silence. Unlike purely mythical figures, Sarah remained both legend and flesh, merging history and imagination seamlessly. This mixture is precisely what fascinates listeners today. Because when we look back at her from modern distance, we see not only an eerie tale of betrayal, but the construction of community myth itself. We watch in real time as one woman's shocking decision is seized by her peers to create ongoing folklore. And in recognizing that, we learn why such stories survive, not because of crime alone, but because of what communities need them to mean. Sarah's story remains a mirror. Hold it up to issues of marriage and see caution against betrayal. Hold it up to issues of gender and see oppression versus rebellion. Hold it up to problems of family and watch loyalty crumble under passion. A mirror this flexible will never be left on dusty shelves. It will be polished, carried, and presented again to each new listener. To fully grasp the haunting grip of this story, one must attempt to step into the minds of the three central figures: Sarah, Joseph, and Nathaniel. In every retelling, their actions seem inevitable, yet none of them could have predicted how history would seal them into archetypes: bride, groom, and brother. But strip away the folklore and legends, and we are left with a far messier, more human picture, a picture of obsession, fear, passion, secrecy, and desperation. Sarah Whitfield Cartwright had the eyes of her community upon her before she could truly choose her own path. Imagine her girlhood raised in a house where every gesture was measured, every relationship tactical. Her mother drilled persistence into her about appearances, lecturing that good posture and polite silence carried more weight than learning or ambitions. Her father dampened every spark of independent dreaming by reminding her that the family's survival rested on how well she married. In such conditions, Sarah's sense of self was likely fragile, built too often on how others measured her. The bride, described as beautiful and composed, may, behind her quiet smile, have felt caged, yet Sarah was not passive. The act she committed, a cold, deliberate strike at Joseph, proved that beneath her social performance lay a fire. Her decision reveals a young woman unwilling to drown fully beneath expectation. Some interpreted it as madness, but madness is too simple a term. Madness erases agency, pretends her shocking act was a lapse rather than a choice. But what if it was a choice? A desperate, wrong, tragic choice, yes, but unmistakably an act of will? That is why audiences remain unsettled. If Sarah killed Joseph by accident, the tale would have faded as a misfortune. If she struck in madness, pity would have muted scandal. But because her crime appears so intentional, so calculated, listeners are forced to reckon with a deeper terror. The idea that a young woman pushed against the wall by society's rigid design might still find one awful way to write her own ending. Now picture Joseph Cartwright. The polished son, the expected heir, the man who embodied steadiness. People remembered his hymns, his generosity, his commanding posture at barn dances. But layered beneath those impressions was something few openly named. Stories trickled about jealousy, his habit of inserting himself into discussions, his suspicious inquiries into people's lives. One servant claimed he once paced the yard for hours after Sarah spoke to a neighbor's cousin, eyes narrowed as though betrayal hid in every shadow. Was Joseph desperately in love, or was he desperate to control? The psychological lens suggests his family may have groomed him to embody perfection, but perfection always comes at a cost. Being the first son, expectations fell entirely onto him. Maintain respect, hold authority, secure alliances. Those roles do not leave much room for grace. Perhaps Joseph carried those burdens so tightly that he projected them onto Sarah, expecting her to be not a partner but an instrument of his perfection. And if so, Sarah may have seen not merely a future of respectable living, but decades of suffocating control. This possibility reframes the central question. Did Sarah murder love, or did she murder the grip of power before it strangled her completely? And then there is Nathaniel. If Sarah embodied rebellion and Joseph represented order, Nathaniel was fever itself. He had always been restless, never satisfied to remain second. History books rarely record the lives of second sons unless scandal drags them into memory. Still, those who studied Nathaniel described charisma coiled with danger, someone who could make a tavern roar with laughter or erupt into fists when insulted. Unlike his brother, he embraced reputation not by guarding it, but by challenging it. When Sarah found herself isolated, a young woman pressed under duty and fear, Nathaniel's wildness must have felt like release. His eyes promised what Joseph's discipline never could: freedom from expectation. But was Nathaniel's devotion to Sarah truly about love? Or was she the clearest symbol of victory over Joseph? Psychologists analyzing sibling rivalry often cite the dangerous cocktail of envy and desire when two brothers fall for the same woman. One becomes the safe bet, the other hazardous but intoxicating. If Sarah truly shared an earlier spark with Nathaniel, then Joseph's involvement was not just a romance, it was theft, taking from Nathaniel something he coveted deeply. And when Joseph lay dead, Nathaniel's embrace of Sarah might have been not merely devotion, but conquest. To marry her was to take the last word in a rivalry now ended by blood. Consider what life in the Cartwright household must have been after Joseph's death. Nathaniel, seated at the supper table across from a mother grieving one son and blaming his wife for siding with the killer. A father torn between preserving legacy and confronting scandal. Sarah herself stared at place settings, haunted by memory and whispers. This was not a home free of shadow, but a daily prison of guilt and love twisting against each other. That they chose to live together despite this pressure suggests either profound resilience or reckless defiance that burned hotter than shame. And what of Joseph's ghost? Not the spectral one of folklore, but the invisible ghost within their marriage? Many nights, Nathaniel must have wondered if Sarah truly loved him for who he was, or if she loved him as the continuation of what she had always wanted. Did he wonder if she ever spoke Joseph's name in dreams? Did every argument between them threaten to reopen wounds? Sarah reminding him that his brother's blood was the bridge that joined them. Psychological torment does not need supernatural hauntings. The mere memory of Joseph's absence, staring at them from every corner of that household, must have been enough. The children they bore inherited not only names, but shadows. Sons grew up knowing their uncle was their mother's victim, their father a man judged by kin as a betrayer. Their daughter likely heard neighbors hiss behind her back at market stalls. One can only imagine the psychological toll. Children raised both in love and under constant accusation. For them, family lore was not an evening's ghost tale. It was a lifelong stigma they could never escape. Every milestone carried the weight of whispers, birthdays remembered alongside the anniversary of blood, marriages overshadowed by the grotesque vows their mother once spoke, and so the tragedy deepens. This was never only Sarah's story, nor Joseph's grave, nor Nathaniel's defiance. It was a tragedy woven into generations, stitched into every child's shadow. The human dimensions stretch further than a single murder. They extend into the psychology of inheritance, of what it means when private passion erupts publicly and scars everyone tied to it. This is why the story survives. Because beneath the blood and scandal lies an echo of something every listener recognizes in smaller form. The pressure of family expectations, the weight of comparison between siblings, the consuming risk of desire, the terrifying act of breaking rules to follow love or freedom. Audiences shiver not merely because Sarah committed murder, but because they recognize the threads of ordinary human longing in her extraordinary crime. If Sarah were a victim, she reminds us of how control turns affection into a cage. If she were a villain, she would remind us of how lust can drive betrayal. And if she was both, then she mirrors back our own contradictions, the ways we love yet plot, obey yet resist, cherish yet resent. That is what makes her unforgettable. Not the details of the murder weapon, not the outcome of her trial, but the abyss she forces inside every listener's chest. Could someone we love hide such darkness? Could we ourselves, under strain, defy expectation so completely? The human heart is complicated. For Joseph, it may have been order and pride. For Nathaniel, envy and rebellion. For Sarah, desperation and fire. Tied together, their triangle became combustible, resulting in an act whose smoke still clouds Kentucky's bluegrass hills. The story of Sarah Whitfield Cartwright did not wither with her age, nor did it stay locked inside the small county where the blood was spilled. Instead, it continued to evolve long after her voice was silenced. Each retelling added layers, not unlike a painting brushed over and over until the original disappears under colors of interpretation. What began as a simple fact, the bride killed her groom before their wedding night, became a living legend. And legends change with their audiences. By the early 20th century, the agricultural communities of Kentucky had modernized just enough to deepen nostalgia for their old tales. Generation by generation, storytellers gathered at firesides and churchyards, repeating the saga of Sarah and the Cartwright brothers. Some told it as a cautionary tale, shaking their heads with solemn expressions. Others wove it into ghost story form, claiming that Joseph walked still, lantern in hand, searching for his stolen vows beneath the oaks. Children grew up daring each other to pass the Cartwright farmhouse at night, whispering that they could hear faint sobbing, the widow bride's eternal regret carried on the wind. But what survived beneath these dramatized retellings was not the details of facts, but the skeleton of contradiction. Folklore thrives whenever contradictions live side by side. Sarah's act was simultaneously intimate and public. She murdered in the bedroom, yet did so on the day chosen to bind families together. She twisted the sanctity of devotion into betrayal, then stood again at an altar, replacing the groom with his sibling. Those contradictions fascinated listeners. Life tends to demand clarity. Legends thrive when clarity never arrives, and clarity never truly arrived for Sarah, because the facts, the precise manner in which Joseph was killed, the exact words Sarah spoke after, the true nature of her relationship with Nathaniel before the crime, were obscured from the beginning. All accounts vary. Some witnesses insisted Sarah was cold as she stood above Joseph's corpse. Others swore she wept with devastation. Some declared it was passion. Others ranted it was madness. And in that vacuum of certainty, stories flourished, each listener tailoring Sarah's motives to fit their own fears. In this way, Sarah became both mirror and mask. Conservative preachers wielded her as a mirror of feminine sin, pointing to her crime as proof of Eve's curse, that unchecked womanly desire destroys families. Women in secret whispers invoked her more sympathetically, masking themselves in her memory to confess their anger at controlling fathers or cruel husbands. Storytellers at county fairs used her name to sensationalize for laughter, audiences shuddering in delirious thrill. Stories migrate because they belong to everyone. Sarah belonged to all who had ever felt love bend toward betrayal. The ghostly additions also ensured endurance. Humans are captivated by the thought that violence leaves residue, that the dead do not rest quietly when justice is incomplete. Joseph the groom, cut down, became an emblematic restless soul. Some claimed that at dusk a figure stood at his grave with an unblinking stare. Others described voices calling names in the woods. Of course, rationality dismisses these claims, but folklore is not rational. Ghost accounts extend stories beyond mortal frames. With Joseph haunting the Cartwright lands, the story's end could never be sealed. The cultural value of ghostly folklore extended beyond cheap thrills. It also satisfied psychological hunger. Ghosts stand in for unresolved emotion. Joseph's ghost embodied the weight of questions. Was Sarah guilty of cruelty to an undeserving man? Or was Joseph's spirit restless because the world misunderstood Sarah's desperate act? Thus, the ghost itself became flexible, claimed as evidence by both sides of the interpretation. To those who considered Sarah a villain, Joseph's ghost demanded vengeance. To those, Joseph was cruel. His ghost lingered, suggesting punishment or confession. Either way, the legend thrived. Nathaniel's role in this folkloric evolution is equally fascinating. In official history, he married Sarah, bore children, lived through whispers, and eventually aged into relative obscurity. But in folklore, he became a character no less legendary than Sarah. Some stories painted Nathaniel as the loyal savior who stepped forward to protect Sarah when all others condemned her. Others painted him as serpent-like, seizing his brother's bride and lusting after something forbidden until blood cleared his way. The variety of these sensory tales demonstrates again how the deeper human fascination did not rest on factual certainty, but on archetype. Nathaniel became the eerie embodiment of sibling rivalry, exaggerated into Gothic drama. Audiences enjoy such Gothic exaggeration precisely because it expresses fears too taboo to confess otherwise. Who dares admit envy of a sibling? Who dares admit attraction to a sister-in-law? Folklore thrives by transforming such taboos into exaggerated narratives, offering audiences the safe distance to reflect on their dangerous feelings. Through Nathaniel, communities worked out their discomfort, not because they actually believed he plotted murder, but because by listening, they vented their hidden envy or suspicion at a safe remove. Behind all this, Sarah remained central, the female figure who shifted roles depending on who framed her. Villainess, heroine, victim, temptress. Everyone who retold her story shaped her face for their need, and that is why she survives in the cultural imagination more than a century later. A figure who can be everything is never forgotten, and here's where her story collides with modern audiences in profound ways. Today, true crime obsessions thrive not from mere gore but from contradiction and the sense of unknown. Podcasts, documentaries, YouTube channels, audiences today crave the same tension Sarah represented to her own generation. We long for answers, yet we love the lack of them even more. Sarah's story mirrors the format of the genre centuries before it existed. It offers unsolved questions, dramatic characters, eerie ghost overtones, and an intimate betrayal that still feels outrageous to modern sensibilities. Consider the CTAs within this very narrative context. As you listen to this tale of contradiction, betrayal, and haunting echoes, if this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries, because Sarah's name has endured through 150 years precisely because people shared it. First by gossiping at the market, later by the fireside storytelling, then through the ballads of fiddlers. Today, sharing means pressing send, posting links, and carrying her ghost into another timeline. Every share continues what Kentucky families long ago began, wrapping the next generation in a story too chilling to fade. Returning to psychological dimensions, we can also see how Sarah's story foreshadowed debates still alive today about justice, gender, and power. Did society oppress her to the breaking point, making her more symptom than villain? Did the court, by sparing her, confirm a patronizing view that women lacked full responsibility, a view that stung as much as it saved? Was Nathaniel vile for marrying his brother's killer, or was he brave for defying the reins of shame? Each of those debates existed partially in 1874, but fully in our own time, as people relitigate the same questions with new words. Thus, every retelling activates present issues. When audiences today hear Sarah's story, they do not only picture old Kentucky, they picture their own questions about abuse, secret love, justice miscarried, and family betrayal. That resonance fuels the modern FOMO trigger. Nobody wants to miss a story that simultaneously chills with Gothic elements and speaks with relevance to their current moral debates. Sarah's scandal has both, and so her life echoes forward, a tragedy merged with myth. In the end, Sarah may never have spoken a public confession that sealed the truth. She lived, loved Nathaniel, raised children, and died carrying her silence. That silence is what fuels everything we know and do not know. Stories with silence at the core always last longer. Each listener fills the silence with their own speculation, and thus Sarah Whitfield Cartwright will not fade into obscurity, no matter how many cartographic details Kentucky loses. The hills still hold her name, whispered in the wind, preserved in echo. The final chapter of Sarah Whitfield Cartwright's story is not written in the ink of official records, nor in the dry pages of legal transcripts, but in the whispers that continue to circulate long after her death. Though her farm eventually passed into other hands, though her children grew older and blended their names into new generations, Sarah herself remained a ghost lodged firmly in conversation. Perhaps that is the most haunting part of any scandal, not the act itself, but the way memory makes the act eternal. The deeper truth of Sarah's case is that every listener creates their own Sarah. For some, she was a murderer who destroyed a man's life on what should have been his happiest day, and who then doubled her crime by standing before her brother-in-law as if she deserved another chance. For others, she was a woman suffocated by unbearable duty, forced into a match that promised only pain, and driven into desperation. For still others, she was both, wicked indeed but sympathetic in circumstance, reminding us that human beings are never so easily labeled good or evil. That multiplicity is what gives the story its power. Legends endure because they hold mirrors to our own hearts. What Sarah's story reflects to us depends on who we are when we hear it. A woman trapped in an unhappy relationship may see in Sarah a portrait of resistance. A man betrayed may see only the sharp sting of disloyalty. A family bound by rivalries may see the dangerous dance of envy twisted into tragedy. And for those fascinated with justice, Sarah's courtroom fate lingers as a provocative question whether mercy was rightly extended or whether gallows justice was denied. There is also the irony of legacy. Joseph Cartwright's stone still rests beneath the shifting Kentucky sky, a marker of a groom who never became a husband. Yet Joseph's life is remembered primarily for the manner of his death. His virtues, his church leadership, his work on the farm have been fogged by a single event. Nathaniel lived decades beyond that night, raising a family, building a household. But to history, he is remembered almost solely as the brother who married his brother's killer. And Sarah, who bore children, managed a home. Aged into shadows of secrecy, she is remembered always as the bride, locked in that single moment where choice and catastrophe became indistinguishable. Isn't that in a way the tragedy behind every true story? That complexity collapses into symbols once gossip and folklore take hold. And yet, human memory does not crave fairness. It craves drama. It seeks stories that explain the dangers of straying, the consequences of passion, the haunting fear that beneath polite society lurks betrayal waiting to pounce. Sarah provided all of that in one life, which is why Kentucky still murmurs her story under the hush of evening, and why listeners far removed in space and time still lean forward when told of her. For us today, Sarah's tale resonates not because we expect to find ourselves in her precise situation, but because her circumstances touch timeless nerves. Who among us has not felt racked by expectation? Who has not wondered what it costs to choose freedom over duty? Who has not feared betrayal from those closest to us? These are universals, carried just as much in 1874 as now. Sarah reminds us that under pressure, the boundaries of morality can blur, and that love and ruin are often opposite sides of the same coin. What makes her story unforgettable is also what makes it disturbing. When we imagine a murderer, we picture a figure cloaked in menace, a highway robber, an outlaw lurking in hills, a stranger in the dark. We do not imagine them dressed in bridal lace beneath ribbons and flowers. That is the horror, the realization that even within love's most sacred institution, betrayal may sprout and bloom in crimson. Weddings promise beginnings. Sarah's promised only endings. That inversion is what lingers. And it is why, more than a century later, the phrase, "the bride who killed her groom," still chills faster than any outlaw tale. True crime and folklore blend seamlessly here. The true crime element reminds us of real people shattered by death, real families enduring scandal. The folklore element transforms that tragedy into a legend large enough for all listeners to insert themselves into. Together, they form the perfect storm of retention. It is why this single local crime outlived similar scandals of its era. Looking across history, Sarah's legacy also challenges us to reconsider how we tell women's stories. Too often they are reduced to angels or monsters. She was called both, and perhaps she was something layered between. Was she guilty of cold calculation, or was she cornered until violence became her release? Was her marriage to Nathaniel a grotesque betrayal of loyalty, or was it the only path she saw toward survival? The refusal of these questions to settle is what keeps her alive, long after her voice fell silent. The Cartwright name may fade, the witnesses long buried, but the story stands. And each time it is retold, Sarah comes alive again, dressed once more in white, blood hidden beneath lace, silence carrying her forward to the next set of ears willing to hear her impossible choice. And so, we arrive at the end, but not the end of her story. For you, the listener, carry it now. Perhaps you will recall it years from now in a quiet conversation. Maybe you will repeat it to someone who has never heard of the Kentucky bride who murdered her groom and wed his brother. In doing so, you keep her with us, as legend intends. And if this tale has chilled you, if it has forced you to wrestle with what you thought love, loyalty, and betrayal meant, then you have felt what families of Kentucky felt in 1874. Shock, fear, curiosity, fascination, perhaps a touch of pity, maybe a rush of outrage. Whatever you think now, Sarah's story has done its work. It has lodged itself inside, timeless as folklore, cruel as crime, unforgettable as legend. Before we truly close, I invite you to do what every generation before us has done: pass the story on. Share it so it lingers in new ears, spread it so the questions ripple wider. And in this modern space, that means something simple. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss stories like this from history's darker shadows. Click the like button if this tale kept you spellbound tonight. And drop a comment below. Did you see Sarah as victim, villain, or both? Do you think her act was desperation or calculation? Your voice becomes part of the legend now. What began in Kentucky in 1874 has not ended. It lives because you remember it. And it endures because you listen tonight.